Welcome back everyone, it is Eric from Rare Candy, and today I'm back with another Scarlet and Violet deck profile. This time we're going to be updating Giratina VSTAR for the brand new post-rotation format, which I'm actually pretty excited about because Giratina did sort of fall off the map after Silver Tempest came out, but thanks to the rotation, kind of nerfing a few other cards or a few other decks in the format, plus some new additions from Scarlet and Violet, I actually think Giratina is in a good spot to potentially reclaim its throne as one of the best decks in the format. But before we get into the deck list, just a heads up guys, if you're in the market for any Scarlet and Violet cards, friends of the channel over at flipsidegaming.com are still taking pre-orders on sealed product. Use coupon code RARECANDY for 10% off, and you'll get free shipping too. But if Flipside is out of stock by the time you find this video, you can also use my affiliate link with TCGPlayer. There's no discount attached, but they will help you find the next cheapest listings online. Links to all these today will be down below in the description. But let's get into the deck list. So kicking things off, we have 4 copies of Comfy, as you would probably expect. I think a lot of the core of this deck is going to look very familiar to anyone who's seen these Giratina decks of the past year. But Comfy's still amazing post-rotation for the flower selecting ability. We get to look at the top 2 cards of our deck, keep one, and put the other into the Lost Zone. But from there, we have 3 copies of Giratina V, and its first attack, Abyss Seeking, actually I think is like slightly better in this new format. You look at the top 4 cards of your deck, keep 2, and put the others into the Lost Zone. So if you think your Giratina is probably safe from a one-shot on the next turn, this actually isn't a bad attack to lead the game with, especially since we're losing Scoop Up Net, making those early explosive turns a little less likely to happen than pre-rotation. So could be a decent attack to fall back on. But of course from there we have 3 copies of the big guy himself, Giratina VSTAR. Still has that same Lost Impact attack that was so great before for a Grass, Psychic, and Colorist as 280, but then we put 2 energy from any of our Pokemon into the Lost Zone. 280 is still such a good number to hit for since that does one-shot all of the popular Pokemon VSTAR, as well as most of the new Stage 1 Pokemon EX. But for Pokemon like Gardevoir EX or Mew VMAX where you're not quite one-shotting them, we do still have that Star Requiem VSTAR power for Grass and Psychic, automatically knocks them out if we have 10 cards in the Lost Zone. This attack was already really good even pre-rotation, but now that Big Parasol is rotating out of the format, fewer decks than ever are going to have ways to actually prevent this automatic KO, which I think is one of the things that does make Giratina so good in this post-rotation format. But we still have our 2 copies of Cramorant just to help put on some early pressure while we're building up our Giratinas. Cramorant is much easier to get going since you only need 4 cards in the Lost Zone to hit for 110 without needing any energy. With Pokemon EX coming back into the mix and us having some of these low HP evolving basics like Ralts as an example running around, this can be a great way of just putting on early pressure, taking cheap prizes. But then on the flip side, we have sort of our late game closer of the deck that is going to be Sableye. Pulling in, of course, for the Lost Mine attack, we have 10 cards in the Lost Zone. We can spread 12 damage counters any way that we want. And I think this attack has only gotten better since we are losing Scoop Up Net. Against other Lost Zone decks, they're almost always going to have easy prizes for you on the field like Comfies. From there, we have a copy of Radiant Greninja for that Concealed Cards ability. We can discard an energy from our hand and draw 2. But also, since we are playing Water Energy in the deck, Moonlight Shuriken is a pretty good sniping attack that we have here. We can discard 2 energy and hit for 90 on 2 of our opponent's Pokemon. But we are also a little bit scared of Radiant Greninja ourselves, which is why I'm also playing our own copy of Manaphy in the deck just to protect ourselves from those bench sniping attacks. From there, we have a copy of Drapion V in the deck. This, of course, is going to help us counter decks like Mew VMAX, since we can one-shot Mew for as little as 0 energy thanks to Drapion's ability. But also, I do like Drapion a little bit more after rotation too, because we can actually one-shot Gardevoir EX, which is looking to be one of the more hype new decks that's coming into the format. Because even though they don't have anything in play that reduces our energy cost, we can still manually power up Drapion with Mirage Gate to be able to one-shot Gardevoir EX. And then from there, the last Pokemon in our deck is just a single copy of Lumineon V, just to search supporters out of our deck, but also Aqua Return, not a bad attack since we do have Water Energy, just does 120 and we shuffle it back into our deck. I will say Lumineon does feel a little bit worse post-rotation, only because this deck no longer has access to Quick Ball, making it a little bit more difficult to use this ability on the turns that we want to. But because this list does play Ultra Ball, I think that helps justify its inclusion a bit more. From there, we have our 4 copies of Colress's Experiment, another staple of these different Lost Zone based decks. So we look at the top 5 cards of our deck, we put 2 into the Lost Zone and keep the others. But in the late game, we also have a copy of Roxanne as well. As always, we can only play it once our opponent crosses that 3 prize card threshold, but then both players shuffle their hands into their deck. We get 6, and then our opponent only gets 2. We also have a copy of Clara in the deck, which is kind of a new addition we haven't really seen in pre-rotation Giratina decks. But since we are losing Ordinary Rod in the rotation, Clara is really the next best way we have at being able to get a similar effect. So of course it does the same thing as Ordinary Rod, but instead of sending the Pokemon energy into our deck, they go straight to our hand. And then from there, just to round out our supporter cards, we have 2 copies of Boss's Orders to choose what we want to attack into. But up next from there, we actually have a brand new card entering into the mix. That is going to be 2 copies of Beach Court as our stadium card of choice.
It reduces the retreat cost of any basic Pokemon in play by 1 energy.
This is a card that feels right at home in Lost Zone based decks just because it does give our comfies essentially free retreat and allows us to pivot between them just a little bit easier throughout the course of a game. Up next, as expected, we have 4 copies of Mirage Gate. This is going to be the key card that really helps power up our Pokemon. We can only play it once we have 7 cards in the Lost Zone, but then we search our deck for 2 different types of basic energies and attach them to our Pokemon in any way that we like. We also have our 4 copies of Battle VIP Pass. The card's been great in Lost Zone decks, and that's really not going to change after rotation, I think, either. We can only play the card turn 1, but we get to search our deck for any 2 basic Pokemon and put them onto our bench. Up next, we have another new addition from Scarlet and Violet. That's going to be Nest Ball. We search our deck for a basic Pokemon and put it directly onto our bench. And honestly, I think this card is actually a pretty big upgrade for any Lost Zone deck. You know, outside of when it comes to Lumineon, I think pretty much all these Lost Zone decks would prefer this effect. Lost Zone decks already have to pitch away a ton of extra resources they don't want to when it comes to cards like Colress and Comfey. So not having to discard any additional cards like in the case of Quick Ball is actually, I think, a really good thing for all of these Lost Zone decks post-rotation. But from there, we also have 1 copy of Ultra Ball to round out our Pokemon search cards. I still like the 1 copy of Ultra Ball just because this does give us an out to Lumineon as well as Giratina VSTAR. Otherwise, we're kind of just trying to power through our deck with Colress and Comfies until we find what we need. So I kind of like having the extra out here to these types of Pokemon. As always though, Lost Zone decks do need plenty of switching cards. This one's no exception. We have our 2 copies of Switch, but also we have our 2 copies of Switch Cart as well. I know Switch Cart might look a little bit weird because it is limited to just basic Pokemon,
but since we're no longer going to have Scoop Up Net, this is still another way we have to maybe heal off some damage our opponent was trying to use to set up for some future knockouts, with I think one of the better examples being opposing Lost Zone decks that are going to be using their own Sableye against us. But I also am choosing to play 3 copies of Escape Rope here, forcing both players to switch their active Pokemon. So the reason I do like kind of a heavier Escape Rope count is just because Klefki is a card that is seeing some hype going into Scarlet and Violet, and if our opponent does throw up a Klefki on turn 1 and starts locking our abilities, we do need a way to get that thing out of play. That way we can access our Comfies, our Radiant Greninjas, etc. to start getting set up. We have 2 copies of Energy Recycler just to shuffle up to 5 basic energies back in deck. So without Ornate Rod in the post-rotation format, we definitely still need some ways at ensuring energy is always going to be in deck, just because our Mirage Gates aren't really going to work unless we have energy actually in deck. And our last trainer card is going to be just a single copy of Lost Vacuum. We send a card from our hand into the Lost Zone, but we do get to send any other Stadium or Pokemon tool in play into the Lost Zone as well. And honestly, I've really been loving this card in Giratina. I know this isn't like an insane or wild card inclusion, but since we are losing Scoop Up Net in the rotation, Lost Vacuum does fill kind of a very similar role by allowing us a way at getting additional cards into the Lost Zone. Because if we're actually getting rid of our own Stadium, whenever we played this, that's essentially a +2 into the Lost Zone at that point. So honestly, I really wouldn't even mind a second copy, but I definitely like at least the 1 account. This card seems way too good not to be playing right now. And for our energy cards, we have 4 Psychic Energies, 4 Grass Energies, and 3 Water Energies. So that's where I'm at right now with Giratina VSTAR. And I do still think there is a little bit of flexibility in terms of how you want to build this, like especially in the stadium card department. I think there is some wiggle room to maybe even play things like Temple of Sinnoh or Path to the Peak or something like that too. But overall, I do think this is a pretty strong foundation to start testing from if you guys are interested in this deck for post-rotation. But I definitely want to hear from you guys as well. What do you think about this Giratina list? Are there any cards that you would change? Let me know your full thoughts down below in the comment section. But as always, if you guys did enjoy today's content, remember to leave a like on the video. And if you're feeling a little bit extra generous and want to take that support to the next level, you can also become a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or pick up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.